First good sign. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Come on in. Let me make sure my chat is working. Just going to give everyone a moment to stream on in, seeing you all as numbers ticking up. Imagining you all are as humans entering a space together or virtually, both. And all the stories you might bring to this proverbial table. Feel free to share in the chat what you're reading or something you've loved recently, like a book you've loved recently. I guess you could share whatever you've loved recently. It's the start of the fall season, things you're looking forward to in the fall. And we'll get going in just a few minutes. Actually, less than a few minutes, like a minute. Just time for everyone to join. Feel like it's right after the long weekend, start of the fall. Maybe it's taking everyone a moment, like it's taken me to sort of get into where they're going. So I saw my first leaves changing color today, which I was displeased about. I missed the summer. So anyone else who's missing the summer, you have my great sympathies. And yeah, excellent. Tampa, 95 degrees. Oh yeah, that's true. Well, depends on where you are, right? Thanks for those reading suggestions in the chat. And I think we'll get started. Okay. All right. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Katie Freeman, and on behalf of Mystery Writers of America, welcome to MWA University. MWA-U 2024 includes 6 online classes taught by top-notch crime writers, and with the start of the aforementioned fall season, we've reached session 4 with Daniel Stashower. A reminder that these classes are free to current MWA members. So if you're not a member yet, consider this an excellent reason to join among many other reasons. For this session, we're mixing it up a little bit. Dan will present with slides. So we will do some screen sharing, and then I'll come back on screen to facilitate audience questions, which will kick off with a taste of some other writers' work to get you thinking. Please share any questions that you have in the Q&A box as opposed to the chat throughout the conversation, and we'll get to as many as possible. I'll also be sharing the links to buy Dan's books from Murder by the Book in Houston, our partner bookstore for this series. And now to introduce our presenter. A member of MWA since 1985, Daniel Stashower is a New York Times bestselling author, an acclaimed biographer and narrative historian, and a winner of the Edgar Anthony, I just did that in the opposite order of what I meant to, of the Edgar, Agatha, and Anthony Awards, and the Raymond Chandler Fulbright Fellowship in Detective Fiction, which is just really extremely cool. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Smithsonian Magazine, AARP, the magazine, and National Geographic Traveler, as well as other publications. His books include The Hour of Peril, Teller of Tales, The Beautiful Cigar Girl, and American Demon. As Harlan Coben says, when it comes to historical crime fiction, Stashower is untouchable. Today, Dan will be discussing setting, an essential element in every narrative. As MWA Grand Master P.D. James noted, setting establishes atmosphere, influences plot and character, and enhances the horror of murder. And as Forbes said about American Demon, hang on for the ride. Stashower places you right on the scene. So Dan, please share with us your secrets for successfully setting the stage for our stories.
Thank you, Katie. Let me see if I can get my slides up. Oh gosh, that went better than I thought. So I'm going to start off by thanking you for coming, and I want to read you something from a particular passage. The rain fell in torrents, except at occasional intervals, when it was checked by a violent gust of wind, which swept up the streets, rattling along the housetops and fiercely agitating the scanty flame of the lamps that struggled against the darkness. Through one of the obscurest quarters of London and among haunts little loved by the gentlemen of the police, a man, evidently of the lowest orders, was wending his solitary way. So that's pretty atmospheric in a 19th century Wilkie Collins kind of way. I wonder, Let me just, oh, hang on. I forgot to read the opening line. Bear with me. Here it is. Yes, the opening line of that passage is, "It was a dark and stormy night." So, what's the lesson here? The lesson is that we live in a precarious world. The wisdom of the ages tells us that this passage that I just read is not only bad, it's famously bad. But why? Can we look at this passage and say, in clear, quantifiable, analytical terms, why it has passed into history as a model of how not to do it? Well, yes, my friends, I think we can, or at least we can try. Of all the topics being covered in these MWA University sessions, I believe that setting is the one that's hardest to define. We're also talking about descriptive prose, but I do think at least everybody has a handle on what that is and why it's important. But setting, well, there are a lot of moving parts. It's like the Electoral College. We know it's important. We're just not 100% sure how it works. Now, some of you will know the buzzwords. Setting is character, creating a milieu, connecting character to place, linking details and emotions, establishing a mood. And sure, all of this is important as we wend our solitary way through the obscurest quarters of London. But just to be clear, we're looking beyond whether your stories should be set in a small town or a big city, or whether you should choose the real life mean streets of Los Angeles or a fictional realm of your own like St. Mary Mead. And of course, all of those things are very important decisions in the life of any writer, especially so for a mystery writer. But setting is more than that. I always come back to Chandler's famous phrase, "The streets were dark with something more than night." I can't speak for you, but the first time I read that as a kid, I felt as if the ground had shifted, which is not something many of us would say about "It was a dark and stormy night." If we're doing it right, setting is a tool that advances your agenda on every front, and contains mirror elements of character, mood, tone, theme, and more besides, helping you to hook your reader in ways that may not be obvious on the surface. It will exert a kind of emotional undertow. If we're doing it right, we will make our readers feel things through the setting. So, by now you're saying to yourself, this is all quite interesting in a dry, pedantic sort of way, but what did Elmore Leonard think about it? Some years ago, Elmore Leonard stirred up something of a hornet's nest with his 10 rules for writers, 3 of which were aimed squarely at this subject. So, quoting Elmore Leonard, "Never open a book with weather." He goes on to say, if it's only to create atmosphere and not a character's reaction to the weather, you don't want to go on too long. He continues, the reader is apt to leaf ahead, looking for people. There are exceptions, he says. If you happen to be Barry Lopez, who has more ways to describe ice and snow than an Inuit, you can do all the weather reporting you want. Continuing, Mr. Leonard says, don't go into great detail describing places and things. And he continues, Unless you're Margaret Atwood and can paint scenes with language or write landscapes in the style of Jim Harrison, but even if you're good at it, he says, you don't want descriptions that bring the action, the flow of the story, to a standstill. And finally, Elmore Leonard says, try to leave out the part that readers tend to skip. And he continues, he explains, think of what you skip reading a novel. Thick paragraphs of prose you can see have too many words in them. What the writer is doing, he's writing, perpetrating hoop-de-doodle, perhaps taking another shot at the weather, or has gone into the character's head, and the reader either knows what the guy is thinking or doesn't care. Okay, I'll admit some of that is pretty technical. I mean, hoop-de-doodle is master's level stuff. It's advanced college stuff. It takes us to a pretty advanced level. But we can grasp the basics of what he was trying to say. Elmore Leonard was being deliberately provocative and more than a little tongue-in-cheek. But he was absolutely right. All too often, the passages where an author attempts to set the scene are the clunkiest and most disposable parts of any book. Look, Ma, I'm writing. So it's fair to ask, how can we avoid writing something skippable? Well, let's ask P.D. James. She says, the technical problems of a detective story are to me fascinating. How to balance setting, characterization, and plot so that all three are interrelated and contribute to the whole. Baroness James continues, setting, important in any work of fiction, is particularly so in a detective story. It establishes atmosphere, influences plot and character, and enhances the horror of murder. Sometimes by contrast between the beauty and outward peace of the scene and the turbulence of human emotions. For me, she concludes, the novel invariably begins with the setting. So what jumps out for me in what she says is this insistence that setting must interrelate and contribute to the whole, to the other elements of storytelling. I take that to mean that each element of your story must work on more than one level, not a flat, overly literal description. It was a dark and stormy night, but something that pulls your narrative in the direction of the story, of your characters and your themes. That seems to be the difference between something that's integral to the story and something that Elmore Leonard would skip past. So, how does P.D. James do this? Here's an example of her detective, Adam Dalgleish, approaching a crime scene in A Taste for Death. Before he concentrated on the actual scene of the crime, Dalgleish always liked to make a cursory survey of the surroundings to orient himself and, as it were, to set the scene of murder. That exercise had its practical value, but he recognized that in some obscure way, it fulfilled a psychological need. Just so, in boyhood, he would explore a country church by first walking slowly round it before, with a frisson of awe and excitement, pushing open the door and beginning his planned progress of discovery. Now, that's probably a long way from being the most evocative passage that P.D. James ever wrote, but it's probably as close as she ever came to telling the reader in plain terms what she was up to. The promise of discovery, walking around to get a look, the frisson of awe and excitement, that sense of, I don't know what's going on, but I can't wait to see what happens next. Okay, let's consult one more expert. I wonder, do you suppose that Edgar Allan Poe might have something instructive to say? Why, yes, I find that he does. In a review of Nathaniel Hawthorne's Twice Told Tales, Poe added a little sidebar. He wanted to discuss the ideal workings of a literary artist. He wrote, having conceived with deliberate care a certain unique or single effect to be wrought out, he then invents such incidents, he then combines such events as may best aid him in establishing this preconceived effect. If his very initial sentences tend not to the outbringing of this effect, then he has failed in his first step. In the whole of the composition, there should be no word written of which the tendency, direct or indirect, is not to the one pre-established design. Okay, that sounds pretty good in theory, but how does it work in practice? Let's join one of Poe's unnamed narrators as he contemplates the ancestral home of his boyhood friend, Roderick Usher, who has sent a mysterious summons in which he speaks of nervous agitation and mental disorder. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and the simple landscape, features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul. What was it? I paused to think. What was it that so unnerved me in contemplation of the house of Usher? I scanned more narrowly the real aspect of the building. Its principal feature seemed to be that of excessive antiquity. The discoloration of ages had been great. Minute fungi overspread the whole exterior, hanging in a fine tangled webwork from the eaves. Yet all this was apart from any extraordinary dilapidation. No portion of the masonry had fallen, and there appeared to be a wild inconsistency between its still perfect adaptation of parts and the crumbling condition of the individual stones. Perhaps the eye of a scrutinizing observer might have discovered a barely perceptible fissure, which, extending from the roof of the building in front, made its way down the wall in a zigzag direction, until it became lost in the sullen waters of the Tarn. Vacant eye-like windows. Everything appears solid until you look closely and see signs of decay, especially under the roof. One would almost think that Poe was trying to tell us something. Well, later in the story, and spoiler alert for a story written in 1839, we discover that all is not well with Roderick Usher and his beloved sister Madeline. We begin to suspect that the title of the story, The Fall of the House of Usher, can be taken on more than one level. And in the final stages, as Poe rushes us outside under a blood-red moon, no less, we have cause to remember that barely perceptible zigzag fissure as the house cracks open and the fragments are pulled into the earth. which closes sullenly and silently over the last vestiges of the House of Usher. It all works just as Poe said it should in that piece, in that little bit he did in his review of the Hawthorne book. You can even hear some of the same words that he used at the beginning as he set the scene, repeated and echoed at the end to underscore the distance that we as readers have traveled and the horror of what has happened. To quote Poe himself, his very initial sentences have tended toward the outbringing of this effect. I hear you ask, how is this possible? I hear you ask, can such a thing be accomplished by the likes of me? I hear you ask, Dan, can you and Katie show me examples of this wondrous process? Perhaps even providing humorous examples of what not to do. Ladies and gentlemen, we can and we will during the discussion, the Q&A section here, and I encourage you all to participate as much as you possibly can or would like to. I'm going to begin by reading an example, and then we'll discuss, and then Katie will read a corresponding one. You ready?
Dan, before we start, shall I go ahead and try to share what we'll be reading so people can follow along? Let's see, everyone. Hold for 1 second. Think about setting as I attempt to screen share. One moment.
Oh, you did it.
Okay, all right.
Nicely done.
Here we are.
Okay, here's mine. Holcomb, Kansas has a population of 2,026 people. It is located in Finney County in the western part of the state, and the median income per household is $47,115. The principal crops are wheat, corn, and soybeans. The land is very flat, allowing visitors to see for miles in every direction. The locals take pride in the appearance of their village. At a recent meeting of the town council, it was decided to approve a $23,000 ordinance to beautify the sidewalks outside the county buildings with a pebbled concrete border. And that is from a book called The Holcomb Horror by Anne Alias, published in 1971. I don't know, Katie, do you want to invite people to comment on that first example before we go to the second one?
Sure. Let me, I can't see my screen and share and see your comments.
Oh,
and see
okay.
us. So I'm going to invite people without being able to actually see what they're saying for the moment. So perhaps you can all do that while I read the second example, and then
Okay.
we can take a look at those differences. Does that sound okay, Dan?
Sure.
And while I have a moment, while I'm being awkward in my transition, also just a reminder that you can share those Q&As or the Qs, Dan has the A's, in the Q&A box, and we'll turn to those as well as we go through this conversation. So I get to read this excellent paragraph. The village of Holcomb stands on the high wheat plains of western Kansas, a lonesome area that other Kansans call out there. Some 70 miles east of the Colorado border, the countryside, with its hard blue skies and desert clear air, has an atmosphere that is rather more far west than Middle West. The local accent is barbed with a prairie twang, a ranch hand nasalness, and the men, many of them, wear narrow frontier trousers, Stetsons, and high-heeled boots with pointed toes. The land is flat and the views are awesomely extensive. Horses, herds of cattle, a white cluster of grain elevators rising as gracefully as Greek temples are visible long before a traveler reaches them. And that, of course, is In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, 1966.
Now, look, I'm just going to admit right off the bat, I wrote the first example myself as an example of how not to do it and to provide a contrast to this rather better passage in Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, which, of course, many of you will have read already. Someone has commented here that someone who actually teaches English at Holcomb High School, that it's technical and sounds like something a school board president would write. Exactly so. This first example is full of details. It's teeming with details. But do any of them actually make us feel anything? Not really. They don't make us feel anything other than we're in a school board meeting. Pebbled concrete border. Who cares? But Capote, it's also full of details, but they're wonderful details. And the language itself echoes. A line that I've always loved is, the local accent is barbed with a prairie twang. He's using the language to make you feel it, obviously. And this idea of him being an insider is, to my mind, conveyed in that a lonesome area that other Kansans call out there. It makes you feel like part of the group right away. Yes, Stephen has said the Capote opening gives us a sense of the character of Holcomb, using far more active and vivid verbs. Yeah, that's a great point. The language, in addition to being so beautiful and lush, it is very active. Even when he says something like, the land is flat and the views are awesomely extensive, he puts it over with that horses, herds of cattle, a white cluster of grain elevators, and then that beautiful capper rising as gracefully as Greek temples, giving it that classical element. To my mind, Truman Capote and his rising gracefully as Greek temples is more effective than Anne Alias's pebbled concrete border, or so it seems. So it seems to me.
Dan, just calling up, I have figured out also how to read the chat while screen sharing, while making sure that we can talk. Jen honing in on out there and that feeling of out there, but also bringing us in. Yeah, thank you, Hillary, for that comment as well, the sense of foreboding.
Yeah, absolutely. A sense of foreboding, where the first example feels like a book report or somebody at a city council meeting. This second one feels like someone who's actually there, which Capote actually was. He spent all that time there, as I'm sure you all know. But this feels like a writer who soaked it all up, who has managed to express that sense of foreboding in the language that the locals might use.
Dan, maybe we can get to this in the Q&A, and perhaps we could go to the other example that we were going to share as well. But when we get to the Q&A, just thinking about, like, how do you decide what details, there are some really concrete details here, versus like what emotional relevance and resonance? How do you decide between those things when you're thinking about setting? There's not a lot of facts, I guess, maybe would be the difference between these two as well. But I wonder about, like, how you decide between what I would call details and emotional resonance.
Well, I see this comment from
Yeah.
George is making a great point. The temples being visible long before a traveler reaches them is a very cinematic thing. You can see that unfolding in your mind. When I read that, I think of myself on a horse, moving forward through across the landscape, and this image rising up: horses, cattle, the grain elevators. Whereas in the first example, the land is very flat. That's not going to put any reader into the picture. That's not going to suck you in and give you a visualization of what you're seeing. It's as dry and flat as a piece of language as it can possibly be, in the same way the dark and stormy night is.
Yeah, Georgia, thanks for that comment. It's
I'm sorry,
interesting.
George, I believe I said George.
Well, I was going to say, it's interesting to see, in the first example, the land is very flat. That is, Truman Capote is also writing the land is flat, but like what is surrounding that language is what gives it such, makes it home, I'm not going to finish that sentence because it didn't go anywhere, but you all know what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, no, and it's a good point. In Truman Capote's hands, the phrase "the land is flat" is him clearing his throat for what's coming. The land is flat is not the destination. It's just the curtain rising. Oh, and almost literally rising. There is something about this passage that has the feel of a curtain rising or a camera panning across the landscape to bring you into the scene. I'm sure most, if not all of you who are here have read this book, but it does an incredible job of putting you in the scene and giving you a sense of the setting.
Let's
Should we go on to the
move on.
next one?
Yeah, I think so.
Sure.
And Sheila, thank you as well for that, pointing out the desert clear air that lets you feel and smell it. And Chris, for your summary of the between these two examples. Stephen, I also thought perhaps you could share with your school board president these examples if you need some more vivid writing in your PTA meetings, perhaps. We'll go on to the second one. Here we are. Okay, Dan, take it away.
You bet. There was a November wind blowing that night. It was one of those cold, wet blasts that comes down through the high like a shower of needles and makes your teeth rattle and your bones ache. On nights like that, every sherry hour ends in a polemic. Stooped old dons scuttle across the quad like disoriented crabs, muttering about structuralism and ruby port. Head porters wipe the frost from the inside of the lodge window and give the paraffin heater an angry kick. Anything can happen. There's nothing for it but a good book and a hot cup of lapsang souchong. And that is Oxford Frost by Jim D. Stilo, 1936.
And this one may be familiar to many people as well. There was a desert wind blowing that night. It was one of those hot, dry Santa Anas that come down through the mountain passes and curl your hair and make your nerves jump and your skin itch. On nights like that, every booze party ends in a fight. Meek little wives feel the edge of the carving knife and study their husbands' necks. Anything can happen. You can even get a full glass of beer at a cocktail lounge. And that's Red Wind, Raymond Chandler, 1938. And Jen, I thank you for pointing out what Dan was saying about the curtain rising. I feel like in these sessions for MWA-U, that there's been some conversation about the ways in which setting and place and character are akin to what might be happening on a literal stage. some elements of like playwriting that works its way into fiction and nonfiction on the page.
So just to get this out there, I have to admit that I wrote this top one deliberately to play off of Red Wind, this incredibly effective, magical passage from the Chandler story, to show how this sense of detail woven into the language is so much Chandler's calling card that when you attempt to adapt it elsewhere, in this case, an Oxford college, it falls flat. I mean, I feel like the words are correct. There are some echoes of that Chandler style, Chandler-esque rhythm that we have come to admire, and some of us internalize all these years. But what works for him in California, talking about the hot, dry Santa Anas, just isn't right when transplanted here to, in this case, Oxford. God knows there are all kinds of wonderful books written in and set in Oxford that make use of the language of Oxford, the characters of Oxford, the buildings of Oxford in a way that brings it to life. But this is basically, for me, it felt like, well, I was trying to make a souffle out, but I didn't have any, I wasn't using eggs, and I wasn't using heat, and I wasn't using a frying pan. I was trying to do it with completely the wrong ingredients. And I wanted, or I hoped to show that when you have a case of a writer who has found a language and a sense of rhythm and detail that so perfectly echoes the place where he's setting his stories, you notice when it goes somewhere else, and that might help us to zero in on some of the things that Chandler did so successfully with setting.
Well, I just want to call Lori suggesting another great writer with setting, Joan Didion, about California as well. And just going up a little bit, Linda calling out the line about the meek little wives being such a powerful visual that makes you shiver. Jack, thanks for your reflections on visiting Holcomb, Kansas. After reading In Cold Blood, it feels like maybe a group field trip is in the works for another Mystery Writers of America future activity. It's a beautiful description that you offer there about the eeriness. And Stephen, thanks for your comments about what's changed and hasn't changed. Dan, do you want to comment on Sheila's note that Chandler always knows when to stop the detail?
100%, because Sheila has made a really, really important point. 99 writers out of 100, if they had been lucky enough to come up with the beginning of this paragraph, I know I would have incorrectly been tempted to end on the line, meek little wives feel the edge of the carving knife and study their husbands' necks, because I would have thought correctly, well, I'll never top that. There's not, that is such a great visual. It pulls you right in. It tells you exactly that people are feeling snappish and ugly tonight, and there is something literally in the air. But it takes someone, it's I would guess you would have to say it's Chandler's particular genius that he thought to cap it with that little flourish. Anything can happen. Again, that's a perfectly good note to end on, but he plays it off a little bit, gives us that little bit of humor with you can even get a full glass of beer at a cocktail lounge, which neatly irises the camera in on where he is, what's happening, what he's doing, and we're ready for the story to begin. He's gone from that um, tremendous and incredibly loaded description that he managed to reel off in just a few lines to sort of shrugging, giving us a little wink, and on with the story. I think that's masterful.
Absolutely agreed. And just looking at Hillary's comment about how in the first, the descriptions are not original, but expected.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're just saying too about, I feel you could see when I read the paragraph also that those sentences that you talked about, especially anything can happen, feel like a natural ending. And then to have that last one that also is transportative in a very different way, but makes the paragraph so exquisitely complete. I mean, it's amazing to watch. And yes, yeah, just looking at Elaine's comment, that ending clues you in that this is the character's point of view, not just scenery. So thinking about where the authorial eye is in these paragraphs as well. I think I'm gonna stop sharing now. I see one question in the Q&A and would invite others to add even about, not even, sorry, in addition to the examples that Dan was just giving, other questions that you might have. But before I turn to that, I'm gonna just bring up a couple of things that you started with, saying setting is like the Electoral College, things that we have some conception of, but maybe don't fully understand. And that setting is a tool that advances your agenda on every front, and thinking about how to avoid writing something skippable. I wondered if you might start with thinking about nonfiction writing versus fiction. Are there different approaches when the setting it's there for you in some way? You know where a thing is taking place on the nonfiction side, and in fiction, you're inventing everything about the story. Are there different approaches that a writer might take, or does it feel all, that the things that you might bear in mind for setting are similar in no matter what the what the context is, fiction
I
or nonfiction?
definitely think that the challenges that face a novelist, a fiction writer, are different from the challenges that face a nonfiction writer, but there is a great deal of overlap, and to my way of thinking, a great deal of cross-pollination. The thing that that strikes me as so challenging, and that so many um, nonfiction writers do so well, is even if they're taking you to a familiar place. A lot of us like to read nonfiction that is set in a place we know. They are able to find something new, look at it in a fresh way, in a way that brings it to life. Somebody mentioned Joan Didion, who's an absolutely killer example of that, because her gift, one of her, among her many gifts, was this ability to write about things that felt familiar, but were told through her perspective in a way that made you see them in a fresh way. Now, obviously, uh, um, that's a very, very difficult thing to do. But um, for me, as I work my way towards that, there's when I'm reading a writer like Didion, or her brother-in-law, Dominic Dunn, another great writer of nonfiction, I don't know if this is true for a lot of you, but those are writers that I find I can't read at night when I'm trying to turn it off because it gets the engine going. I read writers like that or Truman Capote or and you're constantly reading with, as a writer, reading with a sense of, oh gosh, how did they do that? And it will become second nature, as you'll know, to with some writers that you're reading, and you're it's almost as if you're reading with I often do read with a little notebook to hand so that I can write things down that I want to think about afterwards. And it always takes the form of, huh, I wonder how they got that effect. And it often is with a surprisingly simple, unadorned language. I'm often put off, and I'm sure this is the case for some of you, by language that seems self-conscious, where what Elmore Leonard might have described as perpetrating hoop-de-doodle. And I'm when you get that sense of, boy, there's a big word, or there's a sentence with a lot of commas in it, where the writer is uh, basically showing you what they can do. Here I go. I'm riding the bicycle, no hands, but watch me go. Uh, and whereas a writer like there's a terrific memoir called Stop Time by Frank Conroy, that the language is terrific and very, very descriptive, but it's also simple. Of course, the example that everybody gives of using simple language to great effect is Hemingway. But there are many others who writing today who are not so overtly Hemingway-esque as Hemingway. I'm thinking of Tobias Wolff, a writer that I'm extremely fond of, who manages to work with very, very simple sentences, but take you to an elevated place in a way that always makes me stop and think.
We've got a question from John about suggestions on incorporating these elements into a first-person scene, and maybe expanding that question a little bit. What does it look like when it's a first person versus third person versus any of the other possible perspectives? What does setting look like when you're considering what perspective you're writing from?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I'd be eager to hear what others think. I have never written fiction in the third person. I've always written it in first person because for me, rightly or wrongly, particularly when I was younger, it always felt like that first person was a conduit to making myself feel what I really wanted to say. As I've gotten older, I find that that the writers that I really admire can do that in the third person. And the advantage of third person where setting is concerned is you're not constricted by what the character, the first person character, can know or see. Your third person narrator can hover above and see the grain elevators in the distance or whatever, whereas something like that might sound false coming out of the mouth of a first person character. Does that make sense?
It does to me. I hope it does to the writers in the room. Let's Sheila's question, and we'll have time for a few more questions if people have any to add to the Q&A box as well. Sheila asks, do you think that the more florid prose is indicative of a writer not knowing their subject well enough to feel confident with fewer words?
It's a great question, Sheila. And please, can you continue to say what you think while I tell you what I think. I, it sounds like I've been encouraging people to use plain language in the way that E.B. White was encouraged us in Elements of Style. And that's not necessarily the case, although I realize that by quoting Elmore Leonard and people like that, it may sound like I'm encouraging you to kill your darlings and strip away uh, needless prose or overly ornate language. Yes, as a general rule, you do want to avoid overly ornate language, but there are plenty of writers out there, and I would say including P.D. James, who we referenced just a few minutes ago, for whom writing in a lyrical style of language comes very naturally. I mean, that passage from Truman Capote, although the language there was quite plain because it was appropriate to the setting, God knows he's capable of uncorking some very florid, and florid is the wrong word because florid carries a negative connotation. So let's say he's capable of uncorking some very lush, rich, ornate language that doesn't make you feel like you want to, like Elmore Leonard would be skipping it. So again, I do feel it's very important for us as writers to take our own temperature while finding our own voice, so that my this will sound self-serving, but my wife, I've heard her say to other people that when she reads my books, it's like hearing me talk. And I can't think of anything I would rather hear. Although, after an hour of this, you're probably tired of hearing me talk. I think it's every writer's job to find a voice on the page that could credibly come out of their own mouths. I hope that makes sense.
It does to me. I feel like, and again, we have time for perhaps one or two more questions if anyone has a final question or comment. It feels like a lot of what you've talked about, Dan, is a difference between literal and layered, that those don't, it's not that they're mutually exclusive, but that setting that is layered, there's a different way of doing that than the literal, especially I think of the first example. The like
Yeah,
details, not the details, but the facts really, which is literal versus layered language that really brings you in, puts you in a place, lets you taste, lets you see, lets you feel it more than having it be told to you, I guess.
let me just say that when I'm doing research for a nonfiction book or for fiction, if I'm doing the research, I don't know what I'm looking for much of the time, but I know it when I find it because it speaks to me on more than one level. So instead of looking up that the town decided to approve $23,000 for a pebbled concrete border, that doesn't make me feel anything. But I will never forget in cold blood when the gentlemen of the press have converged on the jailhouse, I believe it is, where Dick and Perry have been captured. There's a scene in which there's a description of the cars gathered outside, and a cat is trying to reach into the grill of the motor car to get a bird that was struck by one of the cars. Now, that's a hell of a detail, but it's a detail that tells you more than one thing and makes you feel something and exerts what I earlier called an emotional undertow, pulling you in the direction of the story. There are details that can do that and details that do nothing. And it's our job as writers to be able to tell the difference.
I think that really speaks to what you were saying as setting as a tool that advances your agenda on every front. I wondered if we might close with if there's any advice you have for folks as you think through a revision process, like what might it look like to think about setting when you're writing at first, and how does revision, like what role does setting play when you're going through a revision process? I ask this question knowing that everyone's process is entirely
Sure.
different.
Yet everyone's process is different, but I do think it's a great question. And again, for um, people out there, everybody will have their different ways of doing it. Some of you will be using, will have writer support groups, and you'll be passing your pages around to other people. I think the most important thing about a piece of writing that is particularly designed to set a scene is that after you've read it, you're not ready to stop. Again, to come back to that opening of the curtain, instead of delivering some information, here it is. Now you know what you needed to know. The setting should be like the overture that's rising up from the orchestra pit, that's enticing you with mood and feeling so that you are ready for what comes next.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to leave it. I feel like I can now feel an overture coming for the reading for the books I'm going to read next. And also, I just wanted to say this is the first and possibly only time Hoop-de-Doodle is going to make it into a conversation.
Again, a very
Maybe not
technical
only.
term.
No, I love it. I love it. I'm going to anticipate its arrival in future conversations. Um, I wanted to remind everyone, I put the link in the chat, but that our next MWA-U session will be October 9th next month with Jeffrey Deaver on writing a commercial thriller. As an international #1 best-selling author who has sold over 50 million books worldwide in 150 countries, I suspect that he knows exactly what he's talking about when it comes to commercial thrillers. Again, that link is in the chat. We hope to see you on October 9th. And as always, if you're not an MWA member, please check out all that membership has to offer. Dan, thank you so much for all of these insights and very memorable examples. I hope people return to this writing if these are books that you haven't read or haven't read recently, to think about how all of these suggestions and advice might make their way into your stories as well. So thanks everyone for being here and for participating tonight. And Dan, thank you again
Well,
for
thank you.
presenting.
And I'll be here for Jeff Deaver. He's the best.
Excellent. All right, good night, y'all. Bye.